In a gaming space that's becoming increasingly crowded with intentionally retro-styled 2D platformers, Sabotage Studios' The Messenger is daring to do things a little differently. Instead of taking its inspiration from Mega Man, Super Mario Bros., DuckTales, and/or Castlevania like so many others have, The Messenger instead presents itself as a callback to Tecmo's original Ninja Gaiden trilogy for the NES. That would be a unique enough approach on its own, but The Messenger brings one other well-publicized gimmick to the table as well. A time-warping mechanic that allows you to travel between the 8-bit world you start out in and a Sega Genesis-styled 16-bit world in order to open new paths forward and progress through the game. But are these factors enough to make The Messenger stand out from the crowd? The Messenger wastes no time dropping you right into the action with a brief cutscene introducing you to the game's hero, a nameless young ninja living in a small village housing what remains of the human race. It turns out an army of demons has already wiped out most of humanity, and legend says the demon army is bound to strike again and finish the job. And strike again it does, with our ninja protagonist's village going up in flames as the Demon King and his minions launch their assault ahead of schedule. The fledgling ninja is then trusted with an important task: to carry a scroll vital to his clan's survival across the land and deliver it to the peak of the highest mountain. From there, it's up to you to guide our unlikely hero to his destination as you run, jump, wall climb, and slash your way across the land. As you progress, you'll pick up some new equipment granting you additional methods of traversal, such as a wingsuit that gives you a little more airtime and lets you glide over chasms and into updrafts, as well as a rope dart that functions much like a Zelda game's hookshot and pulls you toward whatever surface it makes contact with. There's also the Cloud Step, a key gameplay mechanic introduced in the game's opening moments that combines traversal with combat in a smart, elegant way. Essentially, whenever you strike an enemy or background object with your sword while airborne, you gain an additional jump, and this quickly becomes required in order to make it across large chasms and other such environmental hazards. As you might imagine, the Messenger wastes little time in coming up with devious ways to test your cloud stepping skills, combining white-knuckle platforming over spikes and bottomless pits with light environmental puzzle solving as you plan your cloud stepping while considering the placement of the enemies and strikeable background objects around you. Fortunately, the game's controls are mostly up to the task, proving slick and responsive whether you're playing in TV or handheld mode. Being a 2D platformer, playing with the Switch Pro Controller or anything else equipped with a D-pad is naturally going to be your best bet here, but playing with the Joy-Con L's control stick works well enough too if such is your only option. I do wish the buttons could be remapped to make certain combinations of actions easier on the hands, as there are challenging cloud stepping sequences later in the game that require some real finger gymnastics to get through, and this could have been alleviated with some simple custom control options. That minor control quibble aside, the Messenger just feels good to play in general, and making your way through the various stages and overcoming their myriad platforming challenges is both rewarding and a great deal of fun. Boss fights are another real highlight, often incorporating cloud stepping while testing your ability to suss out patterns and react to them appropriately, but never feeling overly difficult or unfair. If you think all of this sounds like it makes for a strong action platformer, you'd be right. And if that was the only role the Messenger was concerned with playing, this could have been a very open and shut review with praise to spare. Unfortunately, once you reach a certain point later in the game, the Messenger suddenly puts the brakes on its otherwise brisk pacing and decides it wants to be an open-ended, exploratory Metroid-style platformer instead, and this is where the warts begin to show. Following this change in focus, you'll suddenly find yourself returning to all the levels you just completed in order to find and explore new areas within them. The purpose of this endeavor being to gather collectibles that are necessary in order to unlock the path to the endgame. And this in itself wouldn't be so bad, except that it quickly becomes apparent that as an action platformer, these levels were not designed to be traversed multiple times forward and backward. And you will be traversing them many times because the amount of backtracking this part of the game requires borders on absurd. So not only are the Messenger's levels a lot more fun to barrel through as an action platformer than they are to explore in a slower paced Metroid-style adventure to begin with, you'll be revisiting them all several times as you make your way to various destinations that are often just far enough from any fast travel point that it feels like a real chore to get there. After all, you've already seen and done everything on the way, oftentimes more than once. Indeed, the Messenger's poor excuse for a fast travel system does very little to alleviate the amount of backtracking associated with the back half of the game, with nothing meaningful to differentiate repeated runs through levels or sections of a level. There is an upgrade tree you're constantly collecting currency to buy power-ups from, which does help make all the backtracking feel slightly less meaningless as your ninja continues to power up, and all this covering old ground does eventually lead to another handful of brand new areas to explore. But that still doesn't take the sting out of all the backtracking and level reruns required to get there, only adding to the feeling that the Messenger would have been better off as a pure action platformer without the shoehorning in of slower-paced, Metroid-style exploratory elements. It's also a shame that this change in overall focus comes hand in hand with the introduction of the Messenger's widely publicized time travel mechanic, which changes the game's aesthetics between 8-bit and 16-bit on the fly. This is a legitimately cool gimmick whose luster never quite wears off, but whose impact is lessened considerably thanks to the myriad frustrations introduced alongside the game's stark change in pacing coming from the first half of the game. Touching on those frustrations a bit further, while the messenger wisely eschews a live space system in favor of simply kicking you back to a checkpoint whenever you die, those checkpoints are sometimes spaced far enough apart that an accidental death can feel more frustrating than it needs to due to all the ground you have to cover to get back to where you were, ground you've likely already covered before to boot. But no matter how many times you have to trek through an area, at least you'll thoroughly enjoy all the sights and sounds every single time. Sabotage Studio really went the extra mile in terms of making both the 8-bit and 16-bit sides of the messenger true to their respective eras, with the latter being especially memorable in terms of how specifically evocative it is of the Sega Genesis style of 16-bit gaming. This is especially true of the soundtrack, which transitions seamlessly between NES-style and Genesis-style versions of the same songs as you phase between the two time periods. The game's composer Eric Brown, also known as Rainbow Dragon Eyes, deserves special mention for expertly crafting these two very distinct versions of the game's soundtrack, both of which go a long way toward conveying the overall vibe of their respective era. And the visuals are no slouch either. The retro-style graphics look great whether you're playing on a TV or on the Switch's screen in handheld mode, and the action all takes place at a consistently smooth 60 frames per second. There was an issue present in the review build where the frame rate would sometimes drop below 60 FPS after 4 hours or more of continuous play, and while I did encounter this bug, I've been assured that it's been fixed for the retail build of the game. It's also worth noting that the messenger lays claim to some genuinely inspired writing and characterization that caused me to chuckle and even laugh out loud more than once. The story and overall writing are somewhat reminiscent of Shovel Knight in the way the game doesn't take itself too seriously but still manages to tell an engaging story with emotionally resonant moments. There's also a veritable slew of references and Easter eggs to uncover in the dialogue, which is a ton of fun for players like myself who enjoy those kinds of details. Significant though the messenger's problems in pacing and focus are, especially after the excellent first half of the game, they don't bring the game down so much that it isn't worth playing. Quite the contrary, I like the messenger and don't regret the time I've spent with the game, which clocks in at a surprising 20-ish hours for a first playthrough and ensures that you're getting good bang for your buck. And if you want to find and destroy the 50 optional power seals that stand between you and the game's true ending, you can expect to add a good 5 to 10 hours on top of that. The issue is simply that the messenger is a good 20-hour game when it could have been a great 10-hour game. Had Sabotage Studio remained focused on keeping the messenger squarely within the action platformer genre, a tighter, more streamlined experience playing entirely to the game's strengths could have been the result. But the introduction of Metroid-style open-ended exploration alongside the gimmick of shifting between the 8-bit and 16-bit eras hurts the game's pacing and puts the focus on backtracking and other slower-paced exploratory elements rather than where it should have remained, which is the game's strong, Ninja Gaiden-style action platforming. But neither can the strength of that core gameplay be denied, cementing the messenger as a good game that, despite its faults, is worth playing for fans of the genre, but nothing more. Hey, thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this review, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and follow us on social media using the links in the video description below. Otherwise, stay tuned to GameXplain for more on the Messenger, the Nintendo Switch, and all things gaming.